Okay, so welcome to everybody in the room and online to this month's CHL SYNAPSE Seminar series. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that here in Canberra, we're on Ngunnawal and Ngumri land and pay respect to the Ngunnawal and Ngumri elders past, present and emerging. And today it's a great pleasure to have Anna Florin as our speaker. She's from the ANU School of Archaeology and Anthropology. And Anna is an archaeobotanist whose research is focused on long-term perspectives on the role of plant foods and their processing and management in world economies. And so today Anna's going to be talking to us about early plant food use and processing from the Madjedbebe site in Northern Australia. So thanks so much, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so making sure that works, yes. Thank you. Today I'll be talking about early plant food use and processing, really with insights from the work I did in my PhD at Madjedbebe in Northern Australia. And I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land to which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngumri, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to thank the Mirarr people and the Grinjaikni Aboriginal Corporation, who are my co-authors on this research. Especially I'd like to thank and acknowledge the work of May Mango and Jacob Janjamer, who are Mirarr and Nordican elder, who worked a lot with me collecting plant foods and cooking and processing them during this research. There's also a myriad of other people who were involved at different points in this research. And I'd like to thank especially Chris and Andy, who were my supervisors while I was doing this. And I'll change the slide in a second. There we are. So first of all, I just wanted to let May and Jacob talk.
Aye alwamot almirar. Aye cast orient mirar. Dalok alibuka-bukang manmi. Kangeyo ena.
Everyone, that's really, I don't know why it's not coming up nicely. There's nothing going on. Oh, good, there we are. So early humans are sort of undoubtedly unique. We spread across the world. We survived in a whole range of amazing environments, and beyond that, we thrived in them and shaped and modified them. How humans were able to do this, and I guess either incorporate or outlive our closest ancestors, is one of these key questions of archaeological debate. Often, however, we look at very specific types of evidence for this, and for one side of this, of the way people move into and interact with new environments, being that of stone tools and zooarchaeological bone remains. So we're looking a lot at hunting, and often not as much at the plant side of this. This is obviously because these things aren't as always as archaeologically obvious, but also because of a tradition of understanding plants in a specific way. Since the 1960s and 70s, and the work of Kent v. Flannery, there's been a really strong idea that plants didn't become important in the human story until the more recent past. When it was originally proposed, this was just after the LGM, where people started to use a whole range of processing techniques to get into plant foods in a more complex way and start to extract the nutrients of them, things like grinding stones. As more research has been done, this has been pushed backwards in time, maybe to look at a distinction between early humans and Neanderthals. But it's always been linked to an idea that that use of a broad range of plant foods then allowed people to specialize quite tightly on a few of them, and was linked to the origins of agriculture, and things like small seeded grasses were then intensively used in the Holocene and really shaped the human experience. I think that this focus on sort of hunting in earlier stuff is still very much within the literature, and it's also in popular debate, this idea of things like the paleo diet and very meat heavy focuses, which we all know have big issues, but we don't have always a lot of data for the plants involved. in the movement of people into new environments. And today I want to talk to you about, actually just ignore this, but just in here at Madjedbebe, which is a site in Northern Australia on Mirror country, and work I've done to look at the use of plant foods in that archaeological site. So Madjedbebe is dated to 65 to 53,000 years ago. The start probability date for that is actually something like 70 to 60,000 years or 50,000 years. So it's quite a broad range, but we think around that time period, people were moving into this part of the world. It's not just the early dates that make Madjedbebe a really exciting archaeological site. This site was excavated in a large amount of the site was excavated, and we've got a really amazing assemblage of ochres, stone tools, things like early grinding stones and ground edge axes. And also, of course, I'm a bit biased, but what I find really exciting is we've got evidence for plants from the very beginning of people moving into this part of the world. This site is still used today as incredibly important to the Mirror people. And the amazing thing is people have continued to come back to the site over 65,000 years, and this is despite some really big environmental changes that were occurring. So if you look here very broadly, we know that when people first entered Sahel, the broader continent of Australia and New Guinea, Madjedbebe was sitting here and about 360 kilometres away from the coastline. It would have been in a drier environment. It was a glacial environment at the time. And people would have moved into a wetter period in MIS3 and then back into a much drier period known as the last glacial maximum, or MIS2. By about 7,500 years ago, the area between New Guinea and Australia would have been flooded and would have had two separate land masses at this point. And this is work by Kashi Norman, which shows actually this black line here is just how close the water comes in, sea level to come in to the edge of these things. So we've got Madjedbebe sitting here, maybe only a kilometre away from where sea levels come at that point, which would be an incredible change for people living in this area. Following this, you would have had the creation of big mangrove areas around the lowlands of this site. So moving from what might have been woodland and bits of monsoon vine forest patches to mangroves right up to the edge of the site. However, as the sea level stabilized and the coastal dunes formed, fresh water from the monsoon, from the yearly monsoon was started to build up on these lowlands, and that over 4,000 to 2,000 years ago really created what we know today as the freshwater wetlands of Kakadu. And these are incredibly stunning and productive environments. And this is actually May out there with her grandson Bob talking about the wetlands. So I really wanted to have a look at plants and how people interact with their environments and draining nutrients out of them over that period of time. And I did this using, I guess, three methods. The first is archaeobotanical analysis. We also did ethnobotanical research and modern reference collections, and also stable isotope analysis of Pandanus nutshell. I'm just going to talk you through this quickly. So as the site was excavated, there was one of the squares in the site was chosen and had 100% flotation done on it, which is essentially the idea that little bits of charred plants that survive from people's fireplaces over time will float to the top. And so instead of sieving, you're getting the plants come straight up, and your heavy residue, everything you'd like to sieve, gets caught below. And so you have these two fractions. So instead of sieving, that's where we did flotation. And this is my colleague Xavier Carrar doing that. And that brought out bits of charcoal remains that we could look at under microscopes. I didn't look at the wood charcoal, that was what Xavier did, but I looked at everything else. So little scraps of people's cooking, essentially, that were falling into fireplaces and being preserved. And to identify these, I compared it to the anatomical structure and also the morphology of plants that we got in the modern reference collection. And for a lot of this material, this included work on a scanning electron microscope, because we're trying to understand the cell structure often of bits of roots and tubers. So alongside this, I had to have a really great reference collection, and worked with this to work out what the botanical anatomy of these different plants were, and then what we were seeing archaeologically, where we could join those up. that reference collection was collected with Maningo and Jacob Jandemer on Mirror Country across and off Kakadu National Park, in a range of different seasons and a range of different environments. And yeah, that was a really amazing part of my PhD, and I'm very grateful for the amount of time that May and Jake spent with me. We didn't just collect a range of plants, but when plants were required a bit more processing, had to be processed in a certain way to be cooked and eaten, we often did that processing as well. And this example is that of anakinjak, which is the cheeky yam or Dioscorea bulbifera. And we went through the steps you have to do to get to that point of being able to eat it, and thought about not just the products that you might eat, but also what the byproducts of that processing practice might be along the way. So for instance, this is from anakinjak again, and these are little aerial bulbils. In other parts of the world, Dioscorea bulbifera aerial bulbils are the part that you eat. In Northern Australia, they're very, very small. And they would never come into sight except if the plant was actually growing on the site, because they're not the bit that's been brought in. This is the actual sort of starchy part of the tuber, and that's it when it's cooked. So you can see that these cell walls that are beautifully shown here just break down entirely. So a cooked version of this mightn't be very identifiable as Dioscorea bulbifera itself, but just as cooked material. The last bit is these little sort of roots that you can see in here. Dioscorea bulbifera is often described as hairy, and those roots are removed before the tuber is finely sliced and leached overnight in running water. And really interesting part of this was looking at this skin that had been peeled off afterwards. I found within them what we call cystoliths, which are made of calcium carbonates. And so they would have actually been quite crunchy and not nice to eat. So not just that there was bits of roots, which if you've ever had a potato, you remove the eyes, but there's a little bit more to that potentially. That's why people remove that part. And the last bit is a toxin called bulbiferin, which is removed when in running water. And we would not see that in the archaeological material, but maybe chemically. That's how the archaeobotanical and the reference collection fit together. The last part of this was to look if we can get a proxy for localized environment in at and around Madjedbebe. The reason we did this is because, as you can imagine, with that flooding that happened about 7,000 years ago, there's not a lot of resources for local environmental proxies, and a lot of lake cores that exist beyond that period of time. So we know a lot about the last little bit of people living there, but not for most of the 65,000 years. We used the principle that delta carbon-13 values of different C3 plants correlate to water availability in their growth environment. And to check how this worked around Madjedbebe, we went and collected plants, and I'll show you in a second, in a range of environments around the site, but also in a transect from Darwin to Catherine to get an idea of how that might map. So essentially we're doing all of this to explore changes in binning, plant and landscape use in response to a changing environment over 65,000 years. So I'm just going to start off with these isotope results because the environment sort of gives us, I guess, the context to look at what's going on. I won't go into this too deeply, but I collected a transect from Darwin down to Catherine, and also in open woodlands, seasonal floodplains, and heavily flooded environments in Kakadu National Park itself. And we found that there was increased carbon-13 values for the ratio of the lighter to heavier isotope with increased precipitation. This is actually in the reverse of what you'd expect usually, but we think what's happening is that Pandana spiralis sits in lowlands that are flooded areas, and where there's high precipitation or low humidity, it's waterlogged for a greater period of the year. And waterlogging actually has a similar effect to drought in the sense that it takes a number of different practices in the plant then means that they close off their stomata and stop taking things in through the normal carbon fixation pathway. So we get the similar change to drought as we do in waterlogging as we do to drought. So anyway, we have a record. I'm not going to go into that too far. Sorry about that. And we're able to look at this back in time. This is the bottom of the site, that's the top. So this is the most recent. We have some really nice periods where we have a lot of pandanus to look at and some where we have very little. So it's not a perfect record at all. But what we found was, yes, we do have lower precipitation in those two periods we'd expect, MIS4 and MIS2, so the two glacial stages that people are living at the site. But interestingly, the data for the lowest amount of precipitation actually comes from the modern data. So it's the most dry and or at least have the least water availability today than it did at those points in the past. And we suggested that that fits with some of the literature we know about what's going on in this part of the world, and potentially monsoons probably still in practice around Madjedbebe the whole way through. And it's not quite as dry, although it is drier during those periods. Interestingly, when you added in the stone tools from the site, it's created an interesting pattern potentially about the way people are using the site. So at earliest occupation, you have a peak in stone tool discard, and you have a similar peak at MIS2. So potentially in these periods where it is drier across the continent, Madjedbebe is dry but not incredibly dry, and might be a place where more people are coming in. And at those two peaks in time, you also have a lot more exotic raw materials. So we're starting to see potentially larger social networks or people having more mobility and bringing those inwards to the site. But the thing I want you guys to think about is what that means for plants on the landscape around people. The whole time people are living at the site, we'd expect there to be woodland and savanna environments. There's probably going to be monsoon vine forest pockets because it's on the edge of this escarpment. So there are places you could get that the whole time, but they're going to be more available in wetter periods. At one point in time, for a couple of thousand years, there would have been mangroves very, very close to the site. And there would have been little bits of freshwater pockets around the place, but that would have been intensively available once the freshwater floodplains come into play. And here I sort of flipped that on you again, sorry. So back to 65,000 years at the top and early here. And phase 2 is that earliest phase. And phase 3 and 4 are still in the Pleistocene, and 5, 6, and 7 are happening in the Holocene time period. So what do we find? Well, I looked at a really large number of charcoal fragments and pulled out just over 8,000 non-wood charcoal fragments from across that sequence, and found 35 distinct types of plant macrofossils. And that included 28 types that were able to be connected to byproducts of distinct plant food processing and then disposal in fireplaces or one or the other. And this includes plant parts that come from fruits and nuts, from seeds, from palm pith and palm heart, and I'll explain the difference in a second, and also from a range of underground storage organs, which is a word for talking about roots and tuber crops, roots and tubers broadly. So what did we find? Anything that's highlighted in green on the next few slides was found in that earliest phase, as well as probably more recently as well. But this gives you an idea of what was going on over time. So there's a whole range of fruits and nuts in the archaeological record at the site that people have been using and potentially sort of splitting into a fireplace. And that ranges from things that are really sweet, tasty, easy to eat. Just grab them. In fact, you can hit a rock at a tree for that one and you get a whole lot of them rain down on you. So very nice little packages of sugar. To things that require quite a lot of work to get nutrients out of them, especially Anyak Nyara or the Pandanus spiralis. It's a lovely photo from just a bit further north, and Betty Meehan's work in the 1970s when she was working with Gujrangali women on their plant food processing, plant food use. And this is the Pandanus. And you can get incredible amounts of fat and protein out of pandanus. It's got higher fat percentage, like 40 to 50% fat than a coconut, and saying that its protein is 20 to 30% protein. So it's a very nutrient-rich food. Processing it with metal tools has been the way that people have been doing it, at least since the McCuttons were operating in that area. And it's quite efficient, although I will say for those who are not very able, and haven't practiced this their whole lives, I actually ended up having to get a mate with a saber-tooth saw, so an electric saw, to open them all up for me when I was doing my isotope work. So it's hard work. And in the past before this, we've got evidence from sort of more inland areas that these probably would have been broken over by pounding with a stone with sort of a a space that it sort of sits nicely in and being bashed open, essentially. So it's a lot of work to get at that, but you can imagine that when it's that high fat in an environment with quite low fat meats, that's quite an important thing. Another part of the site, none of this came from the earliest phase, although one rice grain did come from just below that at about 40 to 50,000 years. There were a few seeds, not a large amount, and most of them come from the most recent time period when people are using the freshwater wetland resources like water lily and the Lumbo nucifera or the lotus. There's also a range of underground storage organs in this archaeological assemblage. I think that our Diaspora transversa is likely being used from the very beginning. And alongside that, we've got a couple of other types of roots and tubers, which cannot be identified to genus, but can be identified broadly to what sort of part of the plant they are. And also in the case of this one, that's been used for very early on to an environment because it's got specific adaptations that suggest it would have been used, come from a watery environment or a semi-aquatic environment. As well as that, actually, this guy's got a lot of phytoliths in it, which suggests if you were eating it, and he's found a lot through the record, you would have had to process it a little bit. Another thing we find is palm pits and hearts. And May and Jay are helping very nicely with showing you what I mean by that. The palm heart is that little section on top. It's only found in really young palms. Well, it's only edible in very young palms. And it can be eaten fresh. It can be lightly sort of cooked and eaten. It's sweet. It's almost like eating bamboo shoot. The palm pith also only take it from small young trees because it starts to get too fibrous over time. But it requires the whole palm stem to be cut, the sides to be removed, it to be roasted, and then mushed with water. Potentially imagine it almost as a sago-y style food, where you're pulling it away, the starch away from the fibrous elements, but not quite as intensive as that. So we find palm pith in the earliest use of the site, and palm heart also comes into record later on. It probably was there in the early stuff, but I think it's just a bit more fragile and harder to preserve as well. So what does this say about what people were doing when they first moved into Australia, into Madjedbebe about 65,000 years ago? Well, this goes along with a lot of work from Eddie Hayes, Richard Fuller, and George Field of an amazing set of grinding stones. There's something like 89 grinding stone pieces found in that earliest layer of occupation. And the majority of them have evidence for being processed for plant use, including potentially seed grinding in some of these. There's no evidence for animal use on those earliest ones, but there is one that's come back as being used to grind a ground edge axe, which is quite cool. As well as this, we know that people are using a range of plants from the archaeobotanical record that fit with the idea of a lot of different types of processing going on, whether that's pounding, different types of cooking, and different multi-step techniques to make sure you're extracting the nutrients you want out of those plant foods. And that's all happening from very early on. How does that fit into how we more broadly understand this area? Well, we know that people are moving into quite environments that would have been we consider extreme very early on in time. Madjedbebe is our oldest evidence of this part of the world. We've got people in the highlands in the Invani Valley by 49 to 36,000 years ago, and they're using pandanus. It's actually a monodroop type of pandanus, so it's a much thinner nutshell and much easier to get into. But there's also potential that they're translocating yams from lower altitudes up to the highlands with them, which suggests a really interesting plant use practice. Work from Naya Cave also suggests the use of yams and fruits and nuts, including potentially toxic tubers and nuts from about 46,000 years ago. As well as that, if we go further afield, there's nut cracking technology going on in Gesher Ben Yaakov in Israel from 650,000 years ago. From 170,000 years ago in South Africa, we've got evidence of tubers being cooked, but these are obviously very small bits and pieces. I'm sure lots of this goes much further back. And definitely seed grinding in Mozambique from 105,000 years ago. So I'd suggest we're seeing a really a group of people are able to process and extract nutrients from plants and using that to move into really interesting environments around the world. And as we move through Wallacea, one of the interesting parts of this is you're moving across from Sunda and a range of animals that are actually quite familiar to Sahul, where you've got a whole range of new things and a lot of faunal turnover as you move through this. Plants are one of the things, especially in rainforests and freshwater and coastal vegetation. There is some similarities across that, whether that be from when these areas were joined together or because there's a little bit of movement on water channels through this area back and forth. That would have had some similarity across here. And a lot of the early things that have been used here would have been known of in the, like, at least in the genera form from back there. So, and the other part of this is if we have a very marine focused subsistence that we talk about people moving early on through this part of the world, that's a really, really low fat diet. It's not like they're eating dugongs very early on. So we don't have, plants would have been incredibly important because they provide these sort of bulks that you need in a diet that's low in fat, whether that be fat or carbohydrates. People can't exist on a high protein diet that is low in fat without those other things. So I'm sure we'll get lots of evidence for people using a range of plants through here. Now, before I go any further, I just wanted to show you this again to sort of orient you. The oldest to youngest, and we've got a range of things that would have been on the environment at different intensities at different times in the past. Looking at this more broadly, this is a correspondence analysis from my assemblage. You've got different phases and different colors, and the sediment matrix, so just material and soil, is in triangles, and the charcoal assemblage that comes from halves themselves is in circles. But basically, you kind of see these things broadly grouped in phases. This little guy over here is the last context for phase 6. And you can see that there's a real pull over here with phase 7, which is the light blue. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 trends in here. And that first one is trend 1, where the last phase of people living here, the last 4,000 years, we've got a very big shift in diet, you can see. And also if we look in here, between phase 2 and phase 4, which are in this darkish grey and orange, and phase 3, phase 5 and phase 6, which are greens and reds here, there's a little bit of a pull out that's what I'm calling my second trend on this correspondence analysis. And I'm going to start there. And I think this trend has a lot to do with the types of plants people are using, whether they are using a range of things. They're using all of these things at all times, but whether they're using things more of stuff that we'd say is very easy to collect from the environment, or we're starting to see them really processing plant foods intensively. So in phase 2 and 4, which are the earliest phase people move into this, which is a glacial stage, a drier stage, and also the last glacial maximum, we see it pull out things like the palm hemp and the pandanus are grouped with those sequences, which suggests there's a lot of more processing going on in environment at that point. In the interglacial phases, we see people using a lot of nuts. It's not like they're not using either of those at either time, but we're getting a trend towards one or the other at that point. And I'll show you this in a slightly different way, just doing a chi-square test, which essentially says, if these were all from the same population, what would we expect them to be? And the more that the adjusted residuals pull away from the middle, the more different they are to what we'd expect. So this shows low ranked or just hard to process plant foods are being more intensively used in the interglacial, the glacial phases of MIS2 and MIS4, and less intensively used in the interglacial phases. So I think what we've got going on is people are able to process these plant foods the whole way through, and it's a technique that they rely on, but they rely on it more heavily during periods where resource abundance would be lower in the environment because it is drier, and also potentially there's more people in that environment. You also see a flip here, but I'm going to talk about that in a second because I don't think it's quite it's quite fitting into this trend in the same way. So back to trend 1, and this is the idea that in phase 7, or the most recent late Holocene phase, when people are living in this environment, we're getting a pull out in this direction. And this is unsurprisingly connected to a whole heap of foods that come from freshwater environments. So the whole range through this, we're seeing people use things from open forest and woodland, from monsoon vine forests, from freshwater, and also things that might kind of share across a couple of these different areas on the landscape. We never see any sort of hints of people using estuarine vegetation, but that's because in this part of the world specifically, there's no estuarine vegetation or very little that is edible. We do see the influx of people using shellfish from these areas and animals from these areas at that point. But that's just not something that we're seeing in the plant food part of the assemblage. As you can see here, we've got things like lotus, sedge tubers, that stem type that we thought was coming from a freshwater area, and water lilies that are being used during that time period. But that's not the only part of it. There's a shift towards the wetlands, which is really a shift to using these incredibly culturally productive resources that people love using today. All of these different things are being found. And as the wetlands sort of develop on these lowland areas around Madjedbebe, we see people really intensively using them. But it's not the only thing that's going on. We also get a whole range of sort of tuber types that we can't get to a genera that are starting to be used. And as well as this, we've stopped having some of the fruits that were being used really heavily for the rest of the sequence being found in that part of the archaeological assemblage. And that includes things like Buchanania that when it was ripe, I spent a lot of time just driving around collecting for grandkids. So it's stuff that's really, really lovely and used very heavily today. So I don't think it's that people have stopped using those things. I think we're getting a shift in the time period that, or the season that people are using the site. So from phases 2 to 6, we get a heavy use of these fruits and nuts that we were talking about. So things like Andujmi or Buchanania or the Syzygium, all these sorts of things, and they're available at the end of Kurun and to the beginning of Gunumalem. And this is a time period of the year where you're moving to the end of the dry season and first rains and into the wet season. And the very, very beginning of the wet, which is sort of when you get big lightning storms across this environment. So for most of the time period of people living here, they may have been coming to this site at other points. We've got lovely evidence to say that they're coming to the site during that sort of part of the year. In phase 7, here, we get a change to plant foods that connect in with the freshwater wetlands. And that shifts the seasonality to say people are definitely coming to the site in the beginning of the dry season. As the areas around these freshwater wetlands are starting to dry out, people are coming in using Madjedbebe because it's close to them and using the resources that are slowly becoming available as it dries out and crocodiles are no longer an issue or less of an issue and those sorts of things. So in Bankaran, Yeke and Worken, we see people moving and using Madjedbebe and collecting plants from freshwater environments around that and bringing it back and processing them in the site. And we don't really get those. So it really does look like a shift in seasonal pattern at that point. It's an interesting time. There's a lot of changes in the cultural environments where you have many more sites come in and be placed around the freshwater wetlands. Some of this obviously might be a reflection of the fact that sites earlier have been destroyed by the sort of flooding of that area and then the inclusion of sort of estuarine around there. But at least we do see people starting to use the freshwater wetlands a lot in that period, and some rock shelters that are close to freshwater wetlands are either starting to be used or more intensively used. It's also a time where we get this sort of X-ray style rock art, and this is a beautiful picture from the Madjedbebe wall of Avaramandi, Jane. And so it seems to be a time where there is a shift in the way people are doing things, likely following these really incredibly productive freshwater wetlands and changing some of the patterns of how they move in this landscape and use it. Another interesting part of this is the whole time people here, it looks like there probably would have been a monsoon system in force, which means that across the wet, you have this really big growth in plants. And then over a drier period of the year, you have the slow dry out of these plants and the creation of a fuel load. And then that cycle starts again. And at the beginning of that cycle, you've got lightning that strikes at the beginning of the wet. And so it's a point today, which is known to be very dangerous for fires if the landscape is not properly looked after. So people are living at Madjedbebe for most of this period of time and moving on to that lowland environment and using the site, and also using a range of plants like fruits and nut trees that have to grow and be present and looked after around that site and survive fires. It's really suggestive that there is some sort of practice of cultural burning that's been going on for a very, very long time in this environment. And this is, of course, Mira practicing this still today. I'm not saying that it's been done in exactly the same way over time, but I suggest that like the presence of people and the fruit trees and nut trees with them is a nice evidence for people in that landscape dealing with that fuel load to a certain point. So this is sort of a picture of what we have at Madjedbebe over the 65,000 year period. And I think it pulls together to suggest that we have a really resilient economy and a group of people who keep coming and using the site despite large-scale environmental change. And there's a lot of flexibility and adaptability in this, and we see a big change with the formation of freshwater wetlands around how people are doing things and what time they come to the site. But this sort of pattern of how they're using plants, a very broad diet, ranging from very sort of easy to collect and eat foods to ones that require a lot of processing and a lot of work, is there from the very beginning. The technologies, and I mean the stone tools, but I also mean the understanding of how you process these foods, the sequence is there from the beginning and is used more and less intensively when it's required at different times in the past. And seasonal mobility seems to be part of that, and so does landscape management and some sort of burning in that environment from very early on. And there's a whole lot of continuity in this. So I'd suggest we have broad spectrum use of plants. Unfortunately, I can't put animals in there because they don't preserve at the site at that earliest point, but I'd suggest to be similar. Broad section use of plants from when people are first entering this area. It doesn't fit this idea that there's something that happens at a certain point in human cultural evolution. It's happening, and it's how people are moving into this environment. And that ability to use that broad spectrum is actually part of the resilience of that economy and how people sort of keep using that site in the face of large-scale environmental change. So I suggest that this evidence from Madjedbebe really suggests that diet breadth and the ability to process plant foods and extract nutrients was crucial to the adaptability of our species and to the process of how we move around the world. I just want to zoom in on Australia for a second before I finish and say this would have meant incredibly different things in different parts of this continent. We've got people moving into rainforested islands, into highlands, onto arid zones. The plants that were being used were really different in different places. There is some continuity across, but as people move downwards, it's a really exciting question of what does broad spectrum look like in some of those environments where you have a lot less plants, but how do we look at that, or at different people are using things in different seasonal ways? It depends on the archaeological record, but B, also how were people using incredible ecological and cultural inheritance of knowledge about their plants and adapting it to new species, new places, new environments and ecologies of plants. And I guess that's what I'm really interested in moving forwards and looking at different sites in this area. So a big thank you to the people on the screen here and also to you for listening.